and you have massive unemployment. There is no unemployment benefits, there is no Social Security, there's nothing to protect people, there isn't even anything approximating the obviously porous now social safety net that we have today. That didn't exist back then. So people are thrown basically out in the street, and indeed, this is what the street often looked like. There's a wave of evictions across Detroit, peaking in 1933. And I want to stress this. The crisis that began in the workplace with the unemployment that followed upon the reduction in production, as obviously there's not enough consumer demand to maintain the economy, given what that chart I showed you before. And so sales fall, and as they spiral downwards, more and more people are thrown out of the plant. The crisis was experienced in the streets. It's a crisis that begins in the industrial economy, but people live it out in terms of homelessness and hunger and eviction in the community. That's where the crisis is most visible, and that's where it's experienced by working people. And it's a great leveler. It's a great leveler as well. Take a look at this photo. Is there something about it that strikes you as a matter of interest, given particularly the picture we looked at earlier of the Klan?
It's integrated.
This is an integrated crowd, so that you have black and white. Now obviously African Americans and Mexican workers, the downturn is all the more severe for them. But nevertheless, it is so severe and so pervasive that now working people are being thrown together. Detroit Welfare Office, by the way, welfare in Detroit is exhausted by 1932. The city's on the verge of bankruptcy. The welfare that they provided was basically food baskets, just one step removed from the charity available from the church. So don't let this confuse you. There is basically no welfare system to speak of. It's a tiny underfunded feature of the city government, and as you can see here, these people are they're not able to get inside. And yet what we have is now a working class which is experiencing this remarkable crisis that has a leveling effect. Whether you're skilled trades or production worker or white or black, men, women, immigrant workers, native born, they're being thrown into a circumstance that starts to look pretty similar for all of them. And as they're thrown into the same welfare lines, many of them are thrown into the same efforts, the initial efforts at resistance. This is the Unemployed Council of 1931. In Pontiac, there were unemployed councils across the United States, but principally in northern cities, organized primarily by radicals of various stripes, predominantly the Communist Party, also the Socialist Party. But here again, you have black and white in the same crowd. And remember again that just a few years before this, it's only 7 years before this, that the Ku Klux Klan nearly wins the mayoral election in Detroit. So something's happening at the base, in the community, that is going to percolate into a new understanding of what labor's future might look like. And these are important steps in that direction. Because what they lead to is a broadened base in the workplace. As the economy starts to recover in 35, 36, a new labor movement emerges, offering a stark alternative to the old AFL. And it's the Congress of Industrial Organizations, of which the UAW is a part, United Steelworkers, United Electrical Workers. A lot of those unions were united in their name. And they approach organizing from a completely different perspective, one that incorporates an understanding of what's happened to the economy. So it's going to be skilled workers and production workers, skilled and less skilled. It's going to be men and women. It's going to be black and white. It's going to be immigrant workers. They open their doors. Rather than subdividing workers into an exclusive group of skilled white workers, they're now opening their doors and they're saying, we have to actually embrace the entire working class. Now that's their principle. It's not always acted on. And there's going to be decades of dispute within the CIO over what that means in practice. But I want to stress this. The first civil rights movement in modern American history begins, in my estimate, with this. In the labor movement. It's not in the churches. It's not in the corporations. It's not in municipalities. It's in the labor movement. This is the first mass-based organization of white workers and black workers that is effectively going to be able to organize in the modern industrial period. There were earlier examples of this. I'm not going to go into it. They failed. This one is actually going to catch on and find a place in the industrial landscape. And I love this picture because this is impossible to imagine back in 1924 in Detroit. The idea that you would find comradeship across the racial divide and act in a concerted manner together is a very new and very recent idea in 1936, 1937. Keep in mind that things can actually change very rapidly once people start to direct their attention to the underlying community circumstances that can contribute to social change. Cigar workers. Now remember, we talked about them a little bit earlier. There was no CIO Cigar Workers Union. It was only the old AFL, and they would only organize the hand rollers, the skilled and exclusively male workforce. These are the women who are tending the cigar machines. They're demanding representation, and initially they go into the CIO. And finally the AFL says, well, you know what, maybe we should change the way we do our practice as well. And so they rewrite their internal constitutions and bylaws to open their ranks to the less skilled and to women workers. So this is an important point in American history. It's going to be, by the way, the seedbed for the civil rights movement of the 40s and the 50s that followed. And for a lot of social change, we could spend obviously an entire semester on this. We won't, but what I want to stress here is that often enough, labor historians would focus solely on what was going on in the workplace. And as I've suggested, there's a lot to talk about in terms of what's happening in the workplace. But one of the things we miss when we do that is that we fail to recognize that these women were not newcomers to collective action. Many of these same women had been very active in the preceding 2 and 3 years in their communities, addressing the nature of that crisis, which was understood by people to be a matter of high prices, evictions, homelessness, and hunger. Many of these same women had been very active in 1935 in Hamtramck, which is, by the way, remember, that's where those cigar plants are, active in the Women's Action Committee against the high cost of living. This was a meat boycott and a protest movement over high prices that began in Hamtramck, spread to Detroit, spread to Dearborn, spread to Lansing, spread to Chicago, and was actually an undercurrent that was percolating in a lot of northern cities as they were protesting the circumstances of price gouging, basically, and the effects of the increasingly concentrated meatpacking industry. It was led by this woman. I want you to keep her in mind because we're going to come back to Mary Zuck. She was the organizer of the meat boycott. She was a laid-off Dodge worker. So here again, she's laid off from Dodge, Maine. She goes into the community. This is her activism as it initiates this meat boycott. But she is going to come back to the story in just a bit in an important manner. This is the mass meeting of 5,000 in support of the meat boycott, addressed by community leaders and union organizers. These were organizers from the Auto Workers Union, not the UAW, the Auto Workers Union, which was the Communist Party union back then that was trying to fill that vacuum left by the old AFL. It was Phil Raymond was the guy. But in other words, you have a lot of people who are very active at the community level, even as the plants are half empty in 32 and 33. A lot of people are basically, their baptism of fire as organizers is folks working on these meat boycotts or working in the unemployed councils, setting up soup kitchens, blocking evictions, demonstrating in front of welfare offices as they go bankrupt and close their doors, and demanding the federal government intervene with unemployment benefits. Here again, largely radicals, political radicals, although the followers and the participants are often enough Democrats, Republicans, what have you, more often than not. That broad and basic community also meant organizing around rent strikes, blocking evictions. And a lot of these strains of community activism are being drawn together by the social media of the day. Can you see it here? What's that? The older folks in the room know what this is.
Early internet.
That's a radio. And what happens is this burgeoning new movement went on the airwaves. And in this case, they're probably listening to WEXL, which had repeated commentary in Polish. A lot of these women are Polish immigrant workers, and they're getting union commentary on the radio. The union, oh, thank you. You can tell what's happening. The Polish Labor Committee had bought 15-minute spots on this and many other stations. So keep in mind, this is brand new. Radio broadcasting only began in 1919, and it really didn't catch on and find a mass audience until the late 1920s. So this is new technology, very definitely being turned to a different kind of use. This is inside the plant at Maser Cressman But you found a lot of folks, as we would interview people who were active in this time in terms of their union organizing, were very much focused on the radio as a way they would link a lot of different struggles together and keep informed of a broader movement. The movement's community-based, in other words, is what I want to draw attention to here. To the unemployed, and I'm talking about the movement. I'm not talking about a union. I'm talking about a movement broadly defined, meaning a working class movement of which unions are a part, but are not seen as the exclusive representation of working class interests. Unemployed councils, renters and consumers leagues. This, by the way, is something that they began to organize in 1935 with community clinics doing a lot of screening around tuberculosis and other issues that were really paramount in working class communities. Ethnic groups and benefit societies, the International Workers' Order, for example, which provided low-cost insurance to workers across a lot of different ethnic groups, was very much an early participant in the union organizing. That's where a lot of those unions would meet initially. Or the Polish Falcons, or what have you. Across the board, these ethnic groups are participating. At least the national NAACP, and later the local NAACP, very much a part of this movement. Radio, as I mentioned, and independent political action. I want to draw a little bit of attention to that because it brings us back to Mary Zuck. Her activism in the meat boycott and some of the early rounds of organizing also galvanized a base of voters. And she was the lead candidate of the People's League that ran for city council in 1936 in Hamtramck. They swept the elections.